Good afternoon. Excuse me. It's Monday, the 2nd of January 2023, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to have Mike Robinson back with us. And we've got David Scott bringing us Northern Exposure from north of the border. And we've also got Mark Anderson.
Well, David, we're going to get started off with a trepidatious look at 2023, according to this graphic. So people staring round the corner, poking the door with a big stick and not quite sure what's on the other side of it.
Not sure what's going to come out, and I thought Brian losing his voice in the first 3 seconds was a good start to the year, and was entirely consistent with that illustration. Now, to inspire us all, though, we have the Prime Minister making an address, and I'm afraid, sorry about this, but I am going to inflict it upon you. Fortunately, it's very short, just like he is.
Hi everyone, I hope you had a happy Christmas. Before we enter the new year, I want to take a moment to reflect. 2022 was tough. Just as we recovered from an unprecedented global pandemic, Russia launched a barbaric and illegal invasion across Ukraine. This has had a profound economic impact around the world, which the UK is not immune to. Now, I know many of you have felt that impact at home. That's why this government has taken difficult but fair decisions to get borrowing and debt under control. And it's because of those decisions that we've been able to help the most vulnerable with the rising cost of energy bills. 3 months ago, I stood at the steps of Downing Street and promised I would work relentlessly on the things that matter most to you. Since then, this government has taken decisive action to back our NHS with record resources to tackle the backlogs, more funding, more doctors, and more nurses. We're also tackling illegal migration and stopping criminals from abusing our asylum system. I'm not going to pretend that all our problems will go away in the new year, but 2023 will give us an opportunity to showcase the very best of Britain on the world stage, continuing to stand with our Ukrainian friends against Putin's brutality and defending freedom and democracy wherever we find it under threat. In this historic year of His Majesty the King's coronation, we will come together with pride in everything that makes this country great. Yes, 2023 will have its challenges, but the government I lead is putting your priorities first. I wish everyone a very happy new year.
Now, what I would describe that as is an empty suit, right? Because he actually managed to say almost nothing at all. We had the automatic, well, it's all Putin's fault and COVID's fault, don't blame me, even though the economic crisis he was personally responsible for. We mentioned the NHS, but the thing that got me is the language. We're going to do things that matter most to you, not specified. We're going to have pride in everything that makes this country great, not specified. It's all vague. It's postmodernism. He's not saying anything. He's expecting the listener to fill the gaps in and put their own meaning in empty words. What do you think, gentlemen?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I think you should be shot for playing that in the first place. But aside from that, I think that is the shape of things to come, David.
Well,
yeah. It's a sobering experience for everyone.
Limp-wristed and insincere, and into my mind came Bring Back Liz Truss.
Oh my Lord. Right, there we go. That's the first thought for 2023.
Brian, it's quite, well, right, any leader that we now get makes you feel nostalgic for the last one is kind of an iron law, so well spotted, Brian. And also you can see why she beat him, because, yeah. And just to illustrate the point, we've got a little cartoon here, thanks to Twitter. I wag on Twitter for this. We've got Rishi as, was it Lord Farquaad from the Shrek film, who was a very short, pompous ruler. And he's saying, well, some of you may have to go without food and heating, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. So there we go.
David, just very briefly before you move on, I just want to mention, obviously I was in Northern Ireland over the Christmas break and we decided to go through Dublin. Now he's saying he's dealing with illegal migration and so on. I just want to make the point that if you're travelling from Holyhead to Dublin on the ferry, you got passport control at Dublin. If you're travelling from Dublin to Holyhead on the ferry, there is no passport control, and obviously there shouldn't be. It's common travel area and whatnot. But of course, British border control, border force actually is not maintaining the border in any kind of fit state at all. Just want to make that point very briefly.
We'll be touching on border issues a bit later in the news.
Yes.
By way of comparison, some similarities, but not that many, we have a little clip here now from Vladimir Putin's equivalent address.
My fellow Russians and dear friends, 2022 is drawing to a close. It was a year of tough but necessary decisions, critical steps towards achieving Russia's full sovereignty and a vital consolidation of our society. This year has revealed the true nature of many things. It has shown the difference between courage and bravery on one hand, and treachery and cowardice on the other, which shows that there's nothing greater than love for our families and relatives, loyalty to our friends and brothers in arms, and devotion to our homeland. This was a year of pivotal and fateful events that set the foundation of our common future and our true independence.
So, it's all about independence, according to Mr. Putin. Now, there were some similarities, tough but necessary decisions. Not sure what consolidation of society means either. But unlike Rishi, Vladimir Putin seems to know what the actual issues are that he's looking to defend, what his country stands for. He mentioned sovereignty, bravery, love, loyalty, devotion, and the homeland, whereas Rishi didn't mention anything. He just left it to the listener to fill in their own views, whatever they wanted. And I think that was the distinction I'd like to make. One leader, right or wrong, knows what he's trying to do. The other one really doesn't seem to. Any comments before I move on, gentlemen?
Well, I think you've summed it up nicely. Of course, many people will say, yes, but it's Putin. But it's the points about the nation state, families, individuals, morality, balance in society. These are the key issues, and it makes me wonder if they are the key issues which the West are determined to stamp out by their desire for regime change in Russia. But that's probably discussion for another time.
So we move on to Financial Times. They've been doing some predictions for the world in 2023, as they do with their wonderful writing staff. So we'll see what we think of this. One question they raised: will there be a ceasefire in Russia's war in Ukraine? Interesting phrasing there, but there we go, okay. And they're quite clear: no. Conditions for lasting ceasefire, let alone a formal peace settlement, are unlikely to be met in 2023, so they see more war. That one I would agree with. The next one on financial matters, now this is the Financial Times, you might hope for quality analysis. Will the Fed start to cut interest rates? No, they say. And they then explain why the market's already building in the Fed cutting interest rates, because the market's not stupid. But they believe the Open Market Committee bureaucrats who say that it's going to be 5% or more, and they're convinced that these people really mean business. So that's the naivety of the Financial Times. I thought that was, in its own way, quite stunning.
Yes, okay, brilliant. Well, let's move quickly on, because Rishi Sunak, of course, mentioned how much they're doing for the NHS. So let's start off with the good news for the year. We have a new COVID variant. It's increasingly causing hospitalizations, according to the mainstream press and the government. It's called XBB.1.5, so we've all got to be scared of that. That's fantastic. But don't worry, we can't go on like this. This is the main headline in many of the press this morning. So this is Sky News. We cannot go on like this NHS under unbearable strain as at least 6 hospital trusts deal with critical incidents. And they're talking about a combination of coronavirus, the flu and RSV. Then we've got Britons resorting to DIY medicine because they're unable to see a GP, new research suggests. So this is a survey of 2,000 people suggesting that people can't get GP appointments and therefore they're taking matters into their own hands. The Guardian asking flu, COVID, RSV, why is Britain so very ill? And I'm just going to say here, David, before we go into your NHS section here, this issue of these three, this triple whammy of flu, COVID and RSV, this has been talked about for over 2 years ago. Here is gov.uk from October 2021. Modelling suggests that this winter influenza and RSV hospital administration and deaths could be 2 times that of a normal year. So that's over a year ago they were predicting that, and in July, I think this was, July 2021, the Mail headline, based on a government press release, up to 60,000 people in England could die from flu this winter because so few people have immunity due to lockdowns, Warren's report commissioned by Patrick Vallance. And again, they were talking about this combination of coronavirus, flu and RSV. In the meantime, have they been preparing? I mean, they were the ones claiming that this was what was going to happen in the coming winters. Have they been preparing for that? Well, no, they have not. They haven't opened any new beds. They haven't produced any new staff. In fact, staff have been leaving in droves, as Debbie has been talking about for quite some time. So, but we don't need to worry. We don't need to worry. It's not Rishi's fault, David. It's just circumstances.
Oh yes, I mean, you wouldn't hold the politicians to blame for the centrally operated, centrally controlled, centrally funded state health sector. I mean, in what way was it anything to do with Rishi?
Indeed, but what's going on in Scotland then?
Right. Okay. So there's a slight sign of reality starting to rear its ugly head. So here we've got Scotsman reporting. The NHS needs a radical whole system reform. So this is a former NHS chief speaking on this, and he says that if the NHS is truly precious, it deserves a robust diagnosis and it requires radical surgery. More money is needed, I'll say that, but it's far from the whole answer. For a start, there's not a cupboard full of trained, experienced professionals just waiting to be recruited. So he then points to failures in access, or promising to fix those failures, largely visible through waiting times, without a willingness to engage on system design and restructuring the way that resources are applied. It's no more than posturing. Quote, the issue will be a series of budget and resource challenges where increasing demand will drive increasingly perverse incentives to the detriment of the people who actually need diagnosis, care and treatment. So he's talking about a whole system collapse here. So this is Professor Gray. So he called for Scotland to learn from countries like Sweden, where they have integrated systems delivered at a local level, less need for central control, so less central planning. Frontline staff and citizens having a say in what's needed. It almost sounds like a free market. Oh, gosh. And he said it requires radical surgery to achieve this. It's time for us to look to Sweden, the Netherlands, Alaska and other international examples, embrace local decision making to promote the contribution of the voluntary sector, recognise the private sector, and create the health and care services for the future with access, quality and sustainability at its core. So it's a bit vague, but he's saying we need to change it and we need to change it radically. Now this is an improvement, because we go back a couple of years here, we see the experts. Let's ask the experts. So this is 2018, so it's not that long ago. They talk about radical action on the NHS. A joint report from the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh and the Good Governance Institute has been published, which sets out 5 radical recommendations for the future of healthcare in Scotland. Do you want to see the radical proposals? The experts agreed. The experts agreed should be already a red flag. The experts agreed that healthcare in Scotland is facing some significant challenges. It's not how they're phrasing it now. And that there must be urgent requirements for radical action. They established the healthcare system must be prepared to take risks. Okay, interesting. And be more innovative when tackling challenges and planning for the future. It said, right, bullet point 1, We need stronger health and social care integration with joint financial agreements. Translate that, we need more central planning. Point 2, we need a new political agreement to depoliticise integrated healthcare. Translate that, we don't want democratic control over the central planning, we just want the bureaucrats to have the power. Point number 3, we're going to create a public platform for more active public engagement, focusing on the true costs of healthcare and the public's essential role in the future design of health and social care. Translation, it's your fault, right, you sick, horrible, grotty people mucking up our beautiful system. Point 4, shifting the balance of care informed by policy-based evidence with a series of clear collective outcomes underpinned by strong governance structures. Translate that, we need more central planning. And we're going to introduce new technologies with evidence-based implementation approaches better supported and managed nationally. Translation, more central planning. So the experts had no idea, and that's why this slight sign of reality rearing its head is quite encouraging, that they're realising that the system as a whole, the way it's formed, the way it's created, how it operates, the incentives, perverse incentives it generates, needs to be radically changed because it is going down. Now, more on that in just a moment. Just before we do, if anyone out there is looking for a job, the Scottish COVID inquiry is looking for a chief executive. The salaries are generous £95,930 a year. So this is for an inquiry announced by the First Minister in August 2021. So we've got from August 2021 to 2023, and we're just now recruiting a chief executive. That gives you an idea how quickly the inquiry is progressing. But if anyone out there in the UK column audience feels they're qualified and would like to apply, do let us know how it goes. I wouldn't maybe mention you heard it here, though. Say you saw it on The Guardian. Going back to the NHS, we've got the Times here reporting that there's rationing treatment amid a policy vacuum. So they're saying there's no political direction to the system. Ian Kennedy, chairman of the British Medical Association, said the NHS all-you-can-eat buffet approach was no longer sustainable. So what he's saying is it can't do everything. We're going to have to say no to people. And we need political leadership as to what to say no, because it's a politically led system, which I maintain is part of the problem. But he's saying that we need political leadership, and the political leadership's too afraid to ever say no on the subject of the NHS. Therefore, the system gets worse and worse and worse. The political leadership becomes part of the problem. Writing the Scottish Mail on Sunday, Kennedy said the NHS is dying because of crippling staff shortages, the A&E crisis, and a broken health and social care system. So it's dying because it's of a broken. The healthcare system's dying because of a broken healthcare system. It's a bit circular. And he pointed to one thing, for example, the SNP are giving away free paracetamol, even though it's very cheap, but it's costing them a lot of money. So it's an example of the inherent inefficiency of central planning. The BMA said it was fundamentally opposed to a two-tier service, but warned that the NHS can no longer offer everything to everyone. So the BMA seems to be in two minds about it, doesn't know what to say. The public and politicians need to decide what they want to prioritise, and they will need to make choices. How do we do that, I wonder? Because there's no price signals, because it's not a free market, it's all centrally controlled, so they have problems. These are the problems manifesting themselves. He said that rationing was already happening, with some appointments and treatments limited unless the condition is causing serious problems. I mean, this is actually old news. Rationing's been going on for a long, long time. This is how the system is unfortunately managed at the moment, and it is awful. Now, we've got a few stats just to show what awful means, and they're interesting. They come from Public Health Scotland. The website's very interesting. You can go and search individual hospitals, individual health boards, and get a really interesting insight on what's going on. It's called NHS Performs, a weekly update of emergency department activity and waiting time statistics. So the number of people, the percentage of people being treated within 4 hours, you see is declining rapidly. It's now down to nearly 60%. So if you're going to go to A&E in Scotland, you're going to have to wait for quite a while. but it's not unprecedented demand, right? It's not. It's a failure of the system. So if you look at the number of attendances, they are just where they were back in 2015, right? It's not the number of people that are going. The problem's not the people. The problem's the system. Going into this a little more deeply, okay, so they're not hitting their 4-hour target, but you see here that both the number over 4 hours, but also the number over 8 hours, and the number over 12 hours, they're all growing. So there's well over 1,000 people waited 12 hours in an A&E during that time period. That's a week in Scotland. So that shows you just how bad it is. Now, I said that the number of weekly attendances is not going up. It's flat. To illustrate this, we have Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, the largest hospital in Glasgow. And you see there the graph, it shoots up at the extreme left-hand side because that's when the hospital opened. But basically, apart from the lockdowns, when the use of the service was suppressed hugely, you see that the level of demand on the A&E is actually below where it was in 2018, 2017, 2019. This isn't the nature of the problem. But, interestingly enough, digging into these figures, we found that both in Glasgow and in Edinburgh, the children's hospitals emergency care was way up. Now, I don't know why the children are getting ill, but they are, and you see that's now a record level from 2015 to now in the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Glasgow. It's the same in the hospital in Edinburgh. That's one to watch. So that's a quick overview of where we're at. There's a small realisation that something needs to be done. There's no political will, control, idea or thought as to what to do about it. The experts are not going to help us. And the system, meanwhile, is in a state of, well, it's very close to collapse.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Just give our viewers and listeners a reminder that just before Christmas we did a really interesting interview with a gentleman called Duncan White. That was called The NHS from Vocational Calling to Common Purpose. And in that interview we started to look in detail at just how the NHS has been collapsed from the inside. So encourage you to get onto the UK Column website and have a look for that. But if we follow through on how the damage has been done to the NHS, let's also just recap with 2 slides with a quote from a policeman who was basically complaining that his policemen were exhausted. This is Steve Hartshorn, National Chairman of the Police Federation. His officers were exhausted and many felt that they were on their knees already. He was saying this because he was coming out and saying why you couldn't have police officers driving ambulances, that they were just too exhausted on their knees. And what we pointed out, of course, was that, well, the comment on their knees was absolutely correct, because this indeed is what the police chiefs organisation has helped facilitate, which is police wasting their time in this type of nonsense instead of doing their job. But it's the agenda that counts. So let's look at the NHS, and a big thank you to a viewer who passed this tweet over to me by a lady called Dr. Renée Hoenderkamp. And what she was picking up on was an article in the Daily Mail saying that NHS bosses want interview panels to justify why they have hired a white person. So what was the hospital? It was the Royal Free. This was the main part of the article. Woke NHS bosses are forcing interview panels to explain why they've hired a white person over someone from an ethnic minority. So the hospital requires reports to be compiled justifying why the successful candidate was deemed more suitable, and they've got a right to the Trust Chief Executive with evidence on how they scored the non-white applicant and come up with suggestions on how the candidate can improve for next time. And while all this is going on, of course, people are dying in the hospital from lack of treatment and care. But what's interesting is a very weak statement by the Royal Free. Of course, we don't know who said it, but the quote is, "We're committed to having a diverse workforce and we seek to ensure all candidates, irrespective of their ethnicity have equal opportunities to work at the Royal Free London. So no investigation by the Daily Mail at all. Nobody's responsible, nobody's accountable, no analysis. Well, we decided we'd do a little bit for the Daily Mail. So who do we think might be accountable? Could it be the chief executive? We've got a Dr. John Connolly here. We've also got the director of nursing. I think it's pretty unlikely that she was involved. We've got a director of operations. Maybe it's this lady. Or we've got the director of financial performance. Was he involved? I think that's unlikely because clearly this is excess bureaucracy, which is going to cost money. We've then got a Natalie Ware, Assistant Director of People. Now, I found this fascinating because to be an assistant, presumably there is a director, but the director wasn't named. So maybe we should be looking at the Director of People. And then we've got directors of nursing and acting directors of operations. So could it be any of those people? Well, we're going to leave it up to our audience to dig deeper, but maybe we should go higher and we should have a look at the London NHS Trust Foundation Board. And we've got Mark Lamb, who's chair there, and we've got Caroline Clark, who's the group chief executive. If you look closer at people, I've just selected some, so we're not saying these people have done anything wrong. We're just pointing out who they are and what their jobs are. We've got this lady who's non-executive. She's done a lot of work with financial industry in the past, so presumably of value to the hospital. We've got this lady here. She is interesting because at the bottom of her CV, you can see that she's been chair of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Task Force and the People Committee. So just maybe she is involved. We've got a Sarah Rapson. Could she be involved? We don't really know. And this brings us back to the chief executive here, who ultimately must be involved. So the Daily Mail can't seem to interview the right people. We would suggest a good starting point would be the chief executive, Caroline Clark, to ask her to justify why a hospital is doing this. And as a little bit of a segue here, David, I'm just going to say we haven't got money for the NHS in the UK, but we've got plenty of money for war in Ukraine and supporting Mr. Zelensky. And you're picking up that the EU is looking for further support.
Well, yeah, so we've got Jens Stoltenberg joined the EU defence ministers at the Foreign Affairs Council to discuss how to support Ukraine, training and military mobility. And it's very interesting that military mobility is something to be reported on extensively during the push to have an integrated EU military union, which essentially was undermined by the Brexit vote, but we were reporting on that several years ago at some length, and here we have military mobility coming once again to the fore. So this is a logistical ability to put large amounts of men and materiel, well, onto the Eastern Front. And it uses the EU civilian infrastructure, piggybacks on top of that, and creates the ability to move rapid military resources anywhere in the EU. But where's the land border? Well, it's in the east.
Yep.
Well, David, all of that, of course, involves money, a lot of money, and we're going to be looking in more detail in our section on Ukraine. But before we get there, let's have a look at this American Congress lady starting to ask the right questions about where American money is going, money that's allocated to Ukraine and other places.
Privileged resolution, and what this will do is it will hold our government accountable for all of the funding for Ukraine. So I want to talk about that a little bit at the end, but let me explain the situation we have here. Congress has appropriated $54 billion to aid in the Ukrainian conflict. And then our president, Joe Biden, has requested another $38 billion this week. The American people, the taxpayers of this country, deserve to know where their money is going and how it's being spent. Let's just break this down a little bit. Of the $54 billion appropriated by Congress, $44 billion is for aid to Ukraine and other affected countries. But what other countries, and how are they affected, And how did the American people's taxpayer dollars go to those countries? And to who? And to what organization? To their government? In what way? Also, how is the military assistance being appropriated? $23.3 billion is for military assistance to Ukraine and other countries impacted by the war. Again, who are the other countries? How are they impacted? Are we talking about Poland, where Ukraine fired missiles and it accidentally killed 2 people in Poland? Is that what we're talking about? But let's talk about the aid to Ukraine. Here in the news, we're just finding out about the situation with FTX and the cryptocurrency. So is American people's taxpayer dollars going to fund aid in Ukraine, but yet it's really funding something else that's happening, maybe ending up in Democrat donors' pockets? Was that helping Democrat campaigns? Was that helping Democrat candidates get elected? $8.9 billion is for the humanitarian assistance, including emergency food and assistance for Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees in the region and for other countries directly impacted by the conflict. Again, what other countries? And how much money went to the other countries? And what organizations are involved? Who runs these organizations? And why did they get the contracts? $11.8 billion in other assistance, including for direct budget support to Ukraine and development aid and other assistance to Ukraine and other affected countries. What development aid? What assistance? Who is running this? These are all the questions the American people have.
So it seems to me that that's a lady who's absolutely on the ball. And just very, very quickly, David, of course, the same business is going on here in UK. Vast amounts, billions of pounds of public money being handed over to Ukraine without any checks and balances. So we've got the same policy running in the States as we have got in UK. We're looking at something beyond governments here. But what did you think of her words?
Well, these are excellent questions. The entire policy position makes no sense because we're simultaneously raising interest rates to reduce the money supply. So this means that it's going to be more expensive to borrow. The Western governments do not have enough taxation income for the size of the state that they have created, even without the Ukraine war. So it's all based on borrowing. So our policy is to drive up the cost of borrowing while simultaneously borrowing to give it to the Ukraine to shoot it at the Russians. This is not very coherent. And then you've got the vagueness in where does the money actually go and the vast amounts of waste that's involved with this. And we've done this once with COVID. We've run this system. We know where it goes because we're now in the mess that we created via the, we're not going to have a real economy. We're just going to print paper money and have a pretend economy for a year, and that'll work out okay. Well, we now know that that doesn't work out okay. We see the inflation that it's caused. And we see the economic dislocation that comes with it. She's right to be asking all of those questions.
I think so, but let's have a look at a little bit more about what she says, because she brings in another subject, of course, which we can align with here in UK. Let's see where she goes.
Now, here, think about it like this. Separately from congressional appropriations, the Biden administration has already committed $17.6 billion in security assistance directly to Ukraine since the start of the war just this year. It's been about 10 months. The Biden administration has also authorized 23 drawdowns, that's selling weapons and equipment, under the Presidential Drawdown Authority since August of 2021 for a total value of $10.6 billion. Now let's compare that, all of this, to what our border receives. Our Border Patrol asks for $15.46 billion to secure the border of the United States. President Trump's border wall would have only cost $22 billion. With the money we've sent to Ukraine, we could have already secured our border, but we're not doing that. We're ignoring the dangers happening at our border and the national security crisis that's happening in our country, while we are completely protecting another country's border and also waging a proxy war with Russia. We had 5 million people cross our border illegally since Joe Biden took office. And let's compare that to how many Russians have invaded Ukraine. 82,000 Russians have invaded Ukraine. I think the American people and the taxpayers of this country deserve to know why the Biden administration and this Congress is so interested in funding the protection of Ukraine's border and not the protection of our border. That's a very good question.
So there we are, key question. We've got exactly the same thing going on in UK. All of the money is being handed over to Ukraine. Meanwhile, we can't seem to control our own borders. So I'm going to suggest what we're seeing is not national policy. This is globalist policy being enacted. And let's bring in Mark Anderson, because of course, Mark, you're on the ground. You're talking to people who are in particular affected by the huge migration into the United States, and it means that both the citizens of the United States are suffering and also the migrants themselves. So welcome to UK Column in 2023. What can you tell us, Mark?
Yeah, Happy New Year, guys. Yeah, the tension is continuing to build, especially in Texas, and I focus a lot on Texas, not just because I live here, but because it comprises about 1,200 miles of the 1,900-mile U.S. border with Mexico. And I've done some reporting on Arizona. The two states together would comprise about 80% of that border and the vast majority of the illegal entries. And here what we're seeing on the screen, the first item I've got up here is Greg Abbott says Texas has bused nearly 16,000 migrants to sanctuary cities this year. This happens to be an Epoch Times headline. And I've got some narrative here that begins to explain the situation at the table. Moving on, when the Texas ranchers, ranch hands, and ex-military citizen border scouts with whom UK Column has been regularly corresponding about the border crisis, when they hear that 3 busloads of migrants from Texas arrived in Washington, D.C., near Vice President Kamala Harris's official home at the U.S. Naval Observatory, they become livid, as they point out, in what's becoming a widespread sentiment that Texas Governor Greg Abbott is facilitating human trafficking, as we're seeing here on the screen. These men and women are fed up, really more than fed up, with Abbott talking tough about border defense while allegedly carrying out the very actions that they say aid and abet the border invasion that Abbott himself officially declared on November 15th, just this past November 15th. And keep in mind that when Abbott made that declaration, he cited the repel the sudden invasion clauses of both the U.S. and the Texas state constitutions, both of them, which is a very important point to keep in mind. And to think that the above noted D.C. drop-off of these illegals on Christmas Eve, and their backgrounds are often unknown, is only a small part of a much larger transfer of illegals into the U.S. heartland. Quote, Texas has bused over 15,900 migrants to sanctuary cities, Greg Abbott himself recently boasted on Twitter, while appearing to be unaware of the inherent contradiction of officially declaring that Texas is literally being invaded, even while he sends the invaders into, in his own words, sanctuary cities. And by definition, as this UK column writer, yours truly, has gathered over the last several years covering the US border crisis and the generally related global cities movement for bottom-up world government, so-called sanctuary cities provide refuge for those entering the US illegally, and these sanctuary cities have been roundly criticized by pro-border sheriffs and others. So what is Greg Abbott actually doing here? Is what I'm being asked by many ranchers, ranch hands, and people that watch the border every day and live on the border. And moving on, in recent years, the largely liberal mayors in major U.S. cities have not only given quarter to illegal entrants, but at times, such as in Oakland, California, and in Chicago, Illinois, have actively tried to thwart efforts by the federal government via the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agency, to actually apprehend the illegals. Curiously, Texas Governor Abbott also noted on Twitter, quote, we're providing relief to local communities overwhelmed by President Biden's open border policy, end quote. Yet, since April of 2022, this third-term Republican governor, whose most staunch critics rate him as a thinly veiled globalist, has transported at least 8,900 illegal immigrants to Washington, D.C., 4,900 to New York City, 1,500 to Chicago, and 630 to Philadelphia. And moving on, we see a letter that Governor Abbott submitted to Joe Biden. And in this letter, I've got some quick excerpts. Abbott's December 2022 letter to Biden, only a little over a month after his invasion declaration, sent only 5 weeks after that invasion declaration to Biden, contains some contradictions. It states in part, quote, "This terrible crisis for border communities in Texas is a catastrophe of your own making," Abbott tells Biden. "These communities and the state are ill-equipped to do the job assigned to the federal government, house the thousands of migrants flooding into the country every day. With perilous temperatures moving into the area, many of these migrants are at risk of freezing to death on city streets." And as I point out, and it's emphasized here, yet Abbott has made sure to transfer these migrants to even colder regions during one of the coldest snaps in terms of weather in a long time, I might add. Abbott's letter to Biden then noted, "Texas has borne a lopsided burden caused by your open border policies." And this is what Abbott added in this same letter to Biden. "The need to address this crisis is not the job of border states like Texas." Oh, really? Instead, the U.S. Constitution dictates that it is your job, Mr. President, Abbott went on to write to Biden, "to defend the borders of our country, regulate our nation's immigration, and manage those who seek refuge here." Now, again, Governor Abbott of Texas is talking out both sides of his mouth, according to the critics that I've been talking to, constitutional sheriffs, ranchers and ranch hands, and citizen border scouts, some of whom are ex-military, who live and operate along the border. They're basically saying that, on the one hand, Abbott invoked both the state and national constitutions in declaring an invasion, and then does the very things that help facilitate that invasion, moving more and more people to the sanctuary cities that Abbott himself in recent years has criticized. And so all of this facilitates the open border as more and more people in Central and South America and other countries of origin, when they hear about what Abbott's doing, even more of them will flood to the border and illegally enter the United States, so they too can be bused to these cities of their choice. And even if they're not cities of their choice, sanctuary cities by definition, whether they're formally sanctuary cities or informally sanctuary cities, by definition, the liberal leftist Democrat mayors that run most of those cities are very prone to give them cover and give them actual refuge from federal detention and apprehension. And Abbott has got to know this, his growing chorus of critics are saying. And so Abbott is really going out on a limb politically here, and according to these critics, showing his globalist true colors. And there's something I'll cover a little later called the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate that puts this in even broader perspective. But this situation in Texas and the greater U.S. border with Mexico is really reaching the near breaking point, guys. And so this is the latest update.
Said, the Congress lady, she was quite right in pointing out that the money can go in for the protection of Ukraine, but it can't be used for the protection of the US borders. Exactly the same policy here in UK. And many of our viewers and listeners will not be aware that we have designated sanctuary cities in UK. So that is also not a national policy for the US or the UK. That is another globalist policy, and this is really now what we're beginning to see. Globalist political agenda is driving in both the US and the UK.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. You'd be very welcome as a member there. We do need your financial support, and that would be very much appreciated. You can pick some stuff up at the UK Column shop, but please also share any material you find online. And David, very briefly, we have a reminder here of the Fornethy Conference.
Yeah, so this is a conference for the Fornethy ladies. So if the Fornethy was a house used by Glasgow Corporation and subsequent bodies for schoolgirls, tens of thousands of schoolgirls went through this institution over a period of 3 decades. So if you are one of the Fornethy women and you suffered abuse or trauma there, please come along to this event. It's 10:30 for 11 o'clock on Sunday the 22nd of January. What we'll have there is we'll have some talks by people who are by Fornethy women who are leading the campaign on this subject matter. Also an introduction by John Shields of the Fresh Start Foundation. I'll be looking at the information we've managed to gather in about 6 weeks of research on the subject, which is going to be quite an interesting story. And then there'll be a chance for the Fornethy women to recount their experience as well. We also have a speech by John Halley, an advocate, who has a very interesting story to tell about how he was treated by the Scottish Government and the child abuse inquiry, and this shows you the nature of the state in these areas. We'll have a panel to discuss the next steps, and Brian Gerrish is coming up to join us, and he'll be doing the closing address. Since we've got Brian in Scotland and we like to work him very hard when he comes up, we've also got a meeting the following night at the Glow Centre Motherwell, 6:30 for 7. Brian's speaking, as is Dr. Bruce Scott and Richard Lucas, and I'll have a few words to say as well. Just one quick pointer towards an article just up on the website, Huston, we have a problem. This is a follow-up to the Stephen Sutherland case. Stephen Sutherland, the unanswered questions, was a 2017 article we did. This is a follow-up to it, and I hope people will have a look at this. It illustrates the failure of Police Scotland and the really the very low quality sort of investigation that now passes for investigation in Scotland, and the failure of them to address the issues that this particular family are raising in any sort of coherent manner. And finally, we've got an event coming up in Edinburgh, Truth Be Told. This is about giving a voice to the injured and bereaved caused by the COVID vaccine rollout. There'll be a number of these all across the country. The Edinburgh one is on the 7th of January, 1 p.m. outside St Giles Cathedral, High Street, Edinburgh.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Now, let's move on to Ukraine. And, well, I wanted to start off with this article in the Mail. This was over the Christmas holidays. Well, the headline is, "Thousands of soldiers from Ukraine's Azov regiment gather to watch a Viking longboat burn at ceremony in memory of their fallen comrades." And the Daily Mail showed this fantastic video that was on Telegram. This is totally promoting Azov Brigade. The Mail is a disgrace here, but they're showing the Viking longboat being burned. So I don't know, I'll ask David for his thoughts in a second, but what this reminded me very much of course, the Norse mythology and so on, very much part of Nazi propaganda during the Second World War, including longboats indeed. But the Mail very keen to promote this idea. But I just want to end by making the point about a couple of the comments on here. So let's have a look at them. This is the true face of current Ukrainianist regime, says one person. Another person saying the Mail supports this filth and the government sends them financial aid, your money. And a final quote here, "Torchlight processions, funny insignia on flags. Where have I seen that before? Apparently they're our best mates now." So David, just very, very briefly on that. Some people understand what the Mail was doing there.
Yes, and we're seeing this more and more, that the comments The comments are the key to these things. It shows where the narrative is failing and people are unpicking it and understanding what's really happening. And there's a particular irony here, because if they're looking to Norse ancestry, well, the Russian people can look to Norse ancestry as well. It's a strange one to pick, unless, of course, you're influenced by Nazi ideology, in which case it's not so strange.
Yeah, indeed. Very quickly here, the Kiev Independent was interviewing Francois Hollande, the former president of France. There will only be one way out of the conflict when Russia fails on the ground, is what he was saying. The usual rhetoric in this, I'm not going to talk about it, but I just wanted to mention, Brian, that Hollande confirming what Angela Merkel had said in December about the Minsk agreements being a cynical attempt to give Ukraine some extra time to prepare and nothing to do with the peace process at all.
Yeah, and of course it now means that, quite rightly, Putin can't trust a word that the West, Europeans or the US says. But of course, our man, the Minister for War, Ben Wallace, over the Christmas period has been saying, well, more war. What else would the Minister of War say? But the Belfast Telegraph picking up here, this is on some sailors who are standing in for border force at Manchester Airport, apparently. And the headline is, Russia must face long-term consequences for Ukraine, says Wallace. I think he should go to Russia and tell the Russians direct. So this is part of what he had to say. The UK is continuing to provide military aid to the government in Kiev, with another 2.3 billion worth of support due next year, current year, to help it acquire the weapons it needs. Money is of no issue if it's to do with killing overseas. It's simply UK public we can't help. He said, very importantly, we should point out and remind the world that what we're seeing is Russia breaking international law, systematically being involved in war crimes and rape and all those things. So no evidence for any of those crass statements, but remember, plenty of money to support a regime which we've just identified as seemingly being very closely aligned to matters Nazi. Ben Wallace, we have to all stand up to that and make sure Russia understands that unless it ceases what it's doing now, there will be long-term consequences. Words fail me, David. I have to give you the opportunity to come in here to see Ben Wallace threatening Russia. This is another flaccid paper tiger. I just do not know how to describe this man. He is so unbelievably... Is he ignorant? Yes, I think he is. Stupid, possibly. Dangerous, absolutely.
What is the point here? Russia stopped. What stops? What, ceasefire? No, that's not what he's saying. They have to withdraw, including from Crimea. They've got to abandon Sevastopol as the main base for their fleet. I'm assuming that's what he's saying. It's not clear. This is incoherent stuff. It's just it's almost childlike in its delivery.
Yes. And in the middle of this article, they wax lyrical because Ben Wallace had picked up apparently on what Gordon Brown had said. I noticed Gordon Brown's comments yesterday. Well, what was this to do with? Well, Gordon Brown obviously knows how to tweet, and he tweeted out, a special international tribunal now taking shape in The Hague could indict President Putin for the crime of aggression. Well, that's a very interesting statement. So here is the old man himself. Britain and the United States should now take the lead in not only supporting Ukraine, but protecting the legacy of 1945. Perhaps that's what they're doing, Mike. The legacy is not the legacy we think of supporting the victims of the Second World War. It's supporting the people who prosecuted it from the Nazi side. But he goes on, the Nuremberg moment that gave us the idea of accountability for international crimes. There should be no hiding place for Russia's warmongers. By striking fear, the long prison sentences lie ahead. Many of his inner cabal could start to distance themselves from Putin. Well, what a shame that some senior members of the Labour Party didn't end up in prison for their conduct in overseas wars, David. This man is truly disgraceful. No wonder he's been working for the United Nations.
And what's he saying? He's saying that we're going to prosecute this as a total war, the same way that we did in the Second World War, where only total defeat of the Russians, presumably Western military marching through the Kremlin, and the prosecution of Putin for war crimes will be an acceptable end to the conflict. He's saying total war, not limited war. That's the implication. Now, he's either stupid or dangerous. I know where my vote goes.
Yeah, both. Well, the BBC, of course, is fully behind Ukraine, so anything Ukraine says, the BBC simply regurgitates using UK public money, of course. But here was a statement by supposedly the spy chief, Budanov, saying that Ukraine fighting is deadlocked. I'd like people to take notice of the BBC journalists that contribute to this sort of stuff, because some of them you can identify, but very often some of them you can't identify. But what did Budanov have to say? He's adamant that Ukraine will ultimately retake all of the territory now under occupation, including Crimea. So this is pure fantasy land, which the BBC would have the British public believe as some form of factual statement. And we've just got to say it's clear now that the BBC is the primary propaganda outlet for Ukraine. And we're going to see more of this type of reporting as it becomes clear that Ukraine is being destroyed. And unless Ukraine stops fighting and starts to talk peace with the Russians, Ukraine is not going to exist as a country anymore. But obviously the EU is also fully on the case for those nasty Russians.
Well, this is what we're hearing from inside the EU, that it's almost impossible to say anything that doesn't have a preamble which is anti-Russian before anything substantial is said. Here we see Ursula von der Leyen being used as the European Commission and has unveiled plans essentially for setting up a gallows for Putin. I'm only exaggerating slightly. Setting up a specialist court backed by the United Nations, not sure how that will work, to investigate and prosecute possible war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. So we're setting up the post-victory Nuremberg trial, but this is another version of it, so one's not enough. So we have to have two courts to prosecute this. We've also got here an EU official tweeting out the EU's new mission, EUMAM, will enhance the Ukraine's military capability of their armed forces in the defence of the country against Russia's war of aggression. Right, so this is the military assistance mission, the EU military assistance mission to the Ukraine. Yeah. And he concludes, military training will now start under the EU flag. I find that particularly creepy.
Well, it's not just creepy, David. That is the European Defence Union finally coming out into the open. I mean, we've seen military training with, we've seen British servicemen wearing the EU flag on various training operations and so on in the past. We've highlighted that in the past. But this, I think, is the first time that the EU has openly announced it.
Yes. And this final slide, this is the press release from 15th November about the launch of the European Union Military Assistance Mission. And the interesting point here is the assistance measure will have a duration of 24 months. So that might give you a clue about how long they at least think the war's going to last.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if we think we're going to see the truth as to what's happening in Ukraine, it's probably not going to come through via Twitter. And I'd just like to flag up that over the Christmas period, one of the tweeters who has put out some extremely good information on what's been happening in Ukraine. Well, when I went looking for the Twitter page, it had gone. And this led me to following through to learn more about this suspended account. And I found it very interesting to actually be reading about Twitter's definition of how it defines the public interest. So it says Twitter generally actions tweets that violate our rules. However, we recognise that sometimes it may be in the public interest to allow people to view tweets that would otherwise be taken down. We consider content to be in the public interest if it directly contributes to understanding or discussion of a matter of public concern. Well, that sounds okay, but as you read on, you find that their limiting exceptions mean that really you've got to be an elected or government official to get the
protection.
To get the protection. So don't think that you're going to be a member of the public with a huge following and you're putting out what is essentially truth and you're going to be able to tweet that out. No, you're simply one of the plebs. You can only possibly get through Twitter censorship if you are part of the government machinery. So this was the second page. You can freeze this and have a look for yourself. But these are the criteria for exceptions here. And essentially, if you are aligned politically, they are going to give you protection. So if you have a look at what Ukraine government was tweeting out, this I found particularly offensive over the Christmas period. But of course, there's plenty of tweets, which is everything about ramping up the violence. So nothing is sacred on Twitter, but if you're Ukrainian government, then anything about the violence and weapons is good. And just a reminder here that it was, of course, the BBC Media Action which set up modern media in Ukraine. And BBC Media Action has been boasting that it's sticking with Ukraine during the conflict. They don't want the conflict to stop. They do want journalists to be protected. But the BBC is clearly supporting Ukraine-backed propaganda. And if we have a little look at BBC Media Action and their board of trustees, I found it very interesting that this gentleman, Nick Pickles, was the former head of public policy for Twitter UK. So presumably the BBC so-called charity, BBC Media Action, won't be banned on Twitter anytime soon.
Well, let's bring Jens Stoltenberg back on screen. He was on the BBC PM programme yesterday. And he had this to say: the Ukrainian forces had the momentum for several months, but we also know that Russia has mobilized many more forces. Many of them are now training. Therefore, what have we got to do? We've got to keep pumping the money in and keep the money flows going and the weapons flows going. This all indicates they're prepared to continue the war, but and also try to potentially launch a new offensive. We need to provide support to Ukraine now, including military support, because that's the only way to convince Russia. They have to sit down and negotiate in good faith and respect Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation in Europe. And this really, for me, Brian, highlights once again what a liar Jens Stoltenberg is. So if we just put that back on screen again for a second, because the only way to convince Russia they have to sit down, we have been actively convincing Ukraine not to sit down. That's we, as in the UK and also the EU, and NATO, actively convincing Ukraine not to sit down. Russia hasn't been the problem here.
Well, indeed, put it from the other side as well. Russia has consistently, until recently, said we are prepared to negotiate, but Ukraine has refused to negotiate. But Stoltenberg calling for this offensive, which Ukraine is not capable of carrying out, is simply going to result in the deaths of tens, hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainians. So Jens Stoltenberg, is he the man that should be brought in front of a Nuremberg trial, perhaps?
Well, possibly. Now let's bring this gent, Christoph Hugsen, on screen. He's the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. He's a former advisor to the German government. And he's calling for the EU. If David's talking about EU military training under an EU flag, he wants the EU to have full nuclear capability. If the US focuses more on Asia, he says, and Europe has to take care of its own security, nuclear capability should no longer be a taboo subject. But here's the kicker, David. Are you ready for it? We should take up this offer and make it a European project that allows British participation. So here we are, Britain into EU defence union as quickly as possible. That's what they're working for. But he's talking about focus of the US onto the South China Sea. That certainly seems to be ramping up nicely in 2023. Here's the war zone. A mock attack on US Navy vessels underway during Chinese fighters' unsafe intercept. So many will have seen the video clip of this over the weekend or over the last few days. The Chinese Navy simulated an attack on a US Navy task group in the South China Sea on December the 21st, the same day that a Chinese J-11 fighter jet intercepted a US Air Force RC-135 surveillance aircraft in what the Pentagon termed an unsafe maneuver. It goes on to say intense Chinese military activity in the South China Sea is hardly unusual, although it's interesting to note in this case the exercise scenario apparently targeted US Navy vessels specifically. On December the 21st, according to SCS Probing Initiative, the US military sent 3 P-8A maritime patrol aircraft, 1 RC-135V surveillance aircraft, and 1 E-3G airborne early warning and control aircraft from Clark Air Force Base and Kadena Air Base to operate over the South China Sea and south of the Taiwan Strait. The RC-135 in question could very well have been the one intercepted by the J-11. As to the RC-135's encounter with the J-11, a US military spokesperson confirmed to Reuters that the Chinese jet actually came within 10 feet of the surveillance plane's wing, but 20 feet from its nose. It was the position of the Chinese jet off the nose, which reportedly caused the US aircraft to take evasive maneuvers to avoid a collision. So there you go. What do you make of that?
What do I think of it? I think it's childish propaganda, because in all big military exercises over a great many years, certainly during the Cold War, there were always close encounters between the various forces. It's what happens in these events. The reason that the Americans are whinging is that this is the first time they've been put under pressure in this way by the Chinese, and they don't like it. But is this unusual? No. Do the Americans do it with their own fighter aircraft? Absolutely. Do the British do it? Yes. So this is a story designed to, I think, get sympathy for the US as the underdog in protecting world freedom, supposedly.
Yes. Let's move back to Mark then.
Okay. Well, Mark, this is coming down to the real human people level, but you've been having a little bit of a look at people who are attempting to defy tyrants.
Yeah. Earlier when I talked about Texas Governor Greg Abbott contradicting himself in both his words and his policies as he claims to be the border defender, as I've been researching this, I came across something here that I've seen before, and it really fits the situation. I would also refer it to what the British Prime Minister was saying earlier, and David was talking about it in today's broadcast, that it was sort of empty words and the people are subjectively encouraged to just fill in the blanks. Well, when you look at the doctrine of the lesser magistrates here, once again, the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, it's something that was developed in 1550 by German Christian men. And this really outlines kind of a governance framework that would be in the interest of freedom, God, and country. And it's something that Greg Abbott could, but is not. He could be, but is not observing, according to some of the people I've been talking to about this. And what is the lesser magistrate doctrine? Well, let's look at it a little bit. This is very interesting. The lesser magistrate doctrine teaches that when the superior or higher ranking civil authority makes unjust, immoral law, policy, or court opinion, and it could be President Biden in this case, especially about the border, the lower or lesser ranking civil authority has both the God-given right and the duty, emphasis, to refuse obedience to that superior authority and, if necessary, actively resist the superior authority. Interesting. Moving on. The doctrine was first formalized by Christian men in Magdeburg, Germany in 1550. The lesser magistrate doctrine is rooted in the historic Christian doctrine of interposition. Interposition is where one steps into the gap, placing themselves in between the oppressor and his intended victim or victims. Interposition can take place verbally or physically. Some Christian activists use interposition to protest at abortion clinics, for example. The law of God is the objective standard, Get that. Mr. Ritchie there in the PM at 10 Downing Street, listen closely. The law of God is the objective standard to which all men and all governments of men are accountable. If civil authorities make law, policy, or court opinion that is contrary to God's law, the lesser magistrates are to interpose and stop the evil. Let those words sink in. Stop the evil can also be translated to mean solve the problem. Moving on a little bit, it also brings the people themselves into it. The duty of the people, meanwhile, is to rally with the interposing magistrates. All public authorities, magistrates, possess lawful authority. If federal authorities do wrong, think of Biden again, it is the duty of state, hear that, Mr. Abbott, county and local authorities to step in and stop the evil or solve the problem. If state authorities do wrong, listen again, Greg Abbott, it is the duty of county and local officials to step in and solve the problem or stop the evil. State, county, and local magistrates take an oath to uphold both their state constitution and the U.S. Constitution. They do not take an oath of subservience to the federal government, nor do they take an oath to blindly obey the authority above them. And a lot of people, I think, wrongly assume that when a state official, let's say Governor Abbott of Texas, takes an oath to uphold both the state and federal constitutions, that the federal part is an act of subservience. It is not. And so Greg Abbott, just to name one example of many, is in that unique position, if he's aware of this doctrine of all, that yes, he argued in his letter to Biden that Biden's primary federal job is to secure the border. But what Texas Governor Abbott seems to be missing, and this is a point brought out by many of his critics with whom I've been speaking, what he seems to be missing is that when President Biden fails and refuses to secure that border, it is the duty of governors like Abbott to step in, to interpose, and secure that border. Because one thing that many of Abbott's critics have pointed out to me, these border ranch hands and border ranchers, is that when Biden got in office in 2021, he immediately went to war against Texas, doing whatever he could to facilitate larger and larger numbers of people entering the Lone Star State illegally. So Abbott's critics say, has known from day one that Biden is not going to do anything substantive, if anything at all, to stop the border breach. And so Abbott has no excuse, according to his critics. This is not my opinion so much, it's theirs. Abbott has no excuse in not taking the ball and running with it and securing the border where he knows Biden will not do it. And again, it cannot be emphasized too strongly that when Abbott invoked the invasion of Texas, he did it through both the U.S. and the state constitution. So absent any federal action, that state constitution becomes the central tool through which Abbott is duty-bound, his critics say, duty-bound to secure that border when the feds won't do it. And it's an interesting thing to move on. There's one more point about the doctrine of the lesser magistrate that's also very important before we get to Matt Trewhella there. They are, and there's 4 planks to this doctrine, and it's in the order of importance. Self-government, number 1. Family government, number 2. Church government, number 3. And last, civil government. Each has its own role, function, and limits. So government is supposed to come from the bottom up, the self, the family, the church, from the bottom up to the civil government, not the other way around. And moving on to the last plank of this all-important topic, we're showing here Matt Trewhella. He's the pastor of Mercy Seat Christian Church, founded in 1988 in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. And he's the founder of Missionaries to the Preborn. He's actually been arrested interposing against abortuaries. Through his research and teaching on the biblical studies of the lower magistrate, Pastor Matt Trewhella came across the Magdeburg Confession, which is an all-important historical work that became the first in the history of mankind to set forth in a doctrinal format what only later became to be known as the lesser magistrate doctrine. Pastor Trewhella and his wife Clara live in Milwaukee. They have 11 children. So that that's one of the main guys that's using and building his work on this doctrine and spreading the word about it. And it's been around a long time, and it provides that foundational infrastructure of how government, in the view, in the context of this doctrine, how it's supposed to operate from the ground up, not the top down, as I mentioned. So it adds a very interesting backdrop to the border issue and many other issues that I'm sure we could think of that would apply to this. So that's what I got, guys.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much for that. It's very interesting. Lots of things going through my head as you're talking, but the key point coming out is that we're all responsible. We cannot do nothing. It's ridiculous if we're sitting commenting but not doing something to actually stop what is happening. That's beholden on all of us, and any official in however lowly a position is also beholden to do something. And I think this takes us back to the fact in UK, the lowest authority you're likely to come in contact with is your parish council. Many people laugh at the parish councils, but actually if the parish council is motivated, they can actually move mountains. So maybe you're giving us a very good prompt to get back to the fact that each and every one of us has got to look at themselves and what we are doing, what we can do in our official positions in order to stop what you're describing as evil, which it certainly is. David, I don't know whether you've got anything just to add on that.
Well, there's a fascinating topic area. It's an area that I'm currently looking into, working on an article for the UK column on just this ground. I think we should come back to this in much longer format and discuss it in depth, because the ability to stand up against tyranny is dependent upon having the intellectual ground on which to stand, and that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Okay, David, let's move on to climate.
Yes, very briefly, the BBC just found a little window between one cold snap and the next one to push the global warming we're all going to fry line. And I was so disgusted, I thought I'd just remind everyone that it is all a lie. We've got here three extracts from the Tony Climate Twitter account, which is very good. It's always given the underlying data, so you can check it all out yourself. And here we see the rise in sea level at the Battery in New York, which is basically uniform all the way back to 1855, so back to the time of Abraham Lincoln. So there's no climate emergency there. We've also got the frequency of hot days in the US, so they're much declined, so no climate emergency there. And we've got maximum temperature in the US, and we see that it's much cooler and more mild and moderate than the 1930s, where you're seeing it's back to the level of sort of the 1920s, really. And again, no climate emergency there. It's all a lie. It's being used to take away our liberty, and the intellectual case seems to have been surrendered by all of our institutions, but not by individuals who have the courage to speak the truth.
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, we're coming to the end of today's news. I think this is a very appropriate tweet by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who we heard speaking earlier in the news. Today and every day is 1776. Never give up our freedoms. Never let the left steal them away. Be a watchman on the wall and stay on guard every single second of every single day, because the left will stop at nothing until they destroy our faith, our families and our freedoms. And it seems to me that that lady is pretty much on the button.
And David, then just to end, we've got a little bit of video here.
A little bit of clip. This is a version of Auld Lang Syne with some video from various protests in Scotland. Friends of the UK column will notice a few faces they may recognise.
Should old freedoms be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old freedoms be forgot and days of auld lang syne. For auld lang syne, my dear, for auld lang syne, we'll take a stand for freedom, yeah, for auld lang syne. We too have marched about the streets and waved our banners fine. We've wandered many a weary foot since auld lang syne.
Well, David, thank you very much for that. Wonderful to see real people doing important things and smiling and having a good time while they're doing it. And can we just say that I think we're really overwhelmed by the support and kindness that UK Column has received over the Christmas period. So many cards, letters, small gifts, small edible items sent to us, and a lot of comments thanking us for what we're doing. And of course, the key one continues to be, thank you for keeping us sane. So thank you for keeping us sane, and thank you all for your support. I hope it stays in 2023. We have got some exciting news in store for you, but you're going to have to wait at the moment.
So we'll be back in a couple of minutes for some extra.
Join us then. Bye-bye.